In late medieval and early modern Europe, punishment had rarely hidden itself. Courts and councils staged it where people gathered, because fear worked best when it got shared. A sentence did not only targeted the body of the condemned, it trained the crowd. Stocks, whippings, brandings and hangings reminded everyone who held power and what disobedience cost. Justice looked public, and it felt final. That display set the rules of the street, but the lesson did not end when the body fell or the blood dried. People carried the story home and repeated it, changing details each time to make sense of what they had seen. Rumour moved faster than any official notice, and it filled in gaps with suspicion. If someone vanished into a cell, neighbours invented reasons. If a punishment looked harsh, they assumed something even worse had happened out of sight. Fear did not need proof, it only needed possibility. That habit of imagining hidden cruelty mattered. It turned punishment into more than law. It became a kind of warning tale that could grow with every retelling. Authorities relied on that growth because uncertainty disciplined people who never broke a rule. And in a world with limited news and uneven literacy, the most gripping version usually won. Facts arrived late, if they arrived at all. The result was simple. Violence stayed real, and stories about violence multiplied even faster. A shift had started to change how violence worked. Courts and church investigators relied less on spontaneous accusation and more on procedures that looked orderly on paper. Officials gathered testimony, compared statements, and recorded every step. Interrogation became a system, not a moment, and once questions got written down, they could travel. A case no longer lived only in the town square. It lived in files. This paperwork created a new kind of expectation, that truth came out through confession. The process pushed toward a final statement that settled everything, even when the evidence stayed thin. Manuals and rules guided what investigators asked, how suspects answered, and what counted as proof. More people faced questioning behind closed doors, away from the public rituals they understood. The public heard results, not methods, and suspicion filled the gap. Once confessions became the official finish line, people started to imagine what it took to reach them. If a person admitted guilt after days of questioning, many assumed something hidden had forced the words out. The written record rarely described every pressure applied, but it still pointed to an unseen struggle. That silence did work of its own. It trained audiences to picture secret tools, secret rooms, and secret cruelty as normal parts of justice. When people later imagined secret machines, the paperwork pointed somewhere else. In case files, torture appeared as a short list of actions, repeated across towns and decades. The strappado did not need an invention, only a rope, a high point, and a body. Arms were tied behind the back. Then the prisoner was hoisted up and dropped in controlled jolts. Shoulders tore. Pain arrived fast. Confessions often followed. Other methods worked the same way, simple, scalable, and easy to explain on a page. Rack-like stretching pulled joints past their limit with steady pressure, not mystery. Thumb screws crushed bone with a turn of a handle, small enough to carry and use anywhere. Sleep deprivation punished without leaving dramatic marks, just exhaustion and confusion. None of this required a special chamber. It required permission, routine, and time. That was the most revealing part, the bureaucracy. Clerks recorded dates, witnesses, and the exact stage of torment, as if it was a procedure like any other. Notes tracked whether the prisoner persisted, whether the pain was increased, whether a statement was repeated verbatim. Tools could be stored, borrowed, moved to the next town, used again. Torture did not spread because it was rare. It spread because it was portable, repeatable, and written down. The Reformation broke Western Christianity into rival camps, and that split quickly turned political. Rulers, towns, and families picked sides, and fear filled the gaps where trust had been. In that fight, stories mattered as much as armies. Each side pictured the other not just as wrong, but as monstrous. Cruelty became proof. If an enemy could be painted as a torturer, then war started to look like self-defense. Printing did the rest. Cheap pamphlets carried true accounts of prisons, interrogations, and secret punishments, and preachers repeated the worst parts from the pulpit. Every arrest turned into a warning tale. Every rumor gained a headline. Details grew sharper and more disgusting because that was what people remembered and retold. Torture stories stopped being only about extracting confessions. They became propaganda, built to harden loyalty and justify retaliation. Once that cycle began, accuracy mattered less than impact. A report of one harsh interrogation could spread as a system, and a single device could multiply into a whole dungeon of imagined machines. The point was not to document what happened, but to prove what the enemy supposedly was. Lurid suffering became a kind of currency, traded for outrage and unity. And the more confessional war escalated, the more these horror stories felt necessary, even inevitable. By the 1700s, a new kind of critic stepped forward. Enlightenment reformers looked at court torture and did not see a useful tool of justice. They saw a machine for mistakes. Writers and jurists argued that pain did not reveal truth. It forced whatever answer ended the suffering. Their target was not only cruelty, it was the whole idea that a confession beaten out of someone proved anything at all. As these arguments spread, the recent past got a new label: barbaric. That word did work. It separated modern society from what came before, and it made reform feel urgent, even inevitable. Ending torture became a marker of progress, a way for states to claim they were more rational and more humane than their predecessors. But it also simplified history into a moral contrast, enlightened now, savage then. That contrast created demand. Publishers, preachers, and popular writers found an audience eager for warnings about old brutality, stories that proved how far society had climbed. Tales of medieval cruelty became lessons, packaged as entertainment with a moral. The more extreme the image, the stronger the message. In this market, accuracy mattered less than impact, and the past became a stage for carefully chosen horrors. By the late 1700s, torture began to leave the courtroom and enter the display case. Legal reform had pushed old punishments out of official use, but curiosity stayed. Private collectors gathered anything that could be framed as medieval: chains, cuffs, blades, locks. They called them relics of a darker age. The label mattered more than the proof. Each object promised a simple story: cruelty, sin, and a warning. During the 1800s, museums and local exhibitions turned that curiosity into a business. Curators competed for attention, and sensational pieces drew crowds faster than careful ones. Items with weak origins got promoted as famous instruments. Broken fragments got completed. Ordinary restraints got renamed as torture. When no artifact fit the expectation, a substitute appeared, rebuilt, combined, or guessed into shape. The public wanted medieval horror, and the displays delivered medieval horror. Those cabinets of horrors did more than entertain. They taught visitors how to imagine the past as a world of secret machines, not paperwork and procedure. Once an object sat behind glass with a date and a story, doubt became harder. The exhibition tag sounded like evidence. Over time, the line between authentic survival and modern reconstruction blurred. A new kind of authority grew, curated certainty, and it prepared the ground for a single, perfect monster. In the 19th century, the scattered hints and earlier horror stories finally hardened into one clean image, a human-shaped iron cabinet lined with spikes. It sounded ancient, it sounded official, and it sounded medieval. German museum culture helped push that idea forward. Curators and collectors needed centerpiece objects that visitors understood in seconds. The Iron Maiden delivered that instantly. It turned vague fear into a single named machine. Popular histories and guidebooks repeated the same details until they felt settled. The spikes became the point, the coffin shape became the proof, and the name became a guarantee. Writers described it as a standard tool of courts and prisons, not an odd rumour. Museums displayed versions of it as if it carried a clear paper trail from the Middle Ages. The story gained authority through repetition. What looked documented started to look undeniable. Once that narrative locked in, it reshaped how people imagined medieval punishment. A complex system of laws, interrogations, and everyday violence got reduced to one theatrical object. The Iron Maiden became a shortcut, one glance, and the past felt explained. It also fit the 19th century appetite for moral contrast, where modern society judged earlier centuries as uniquely savage. The result mattered. A dramatic museum artifact started acting like historical fact. Once the Iron Maiden had been labelled medieval, it stopped needing proof. Travelling exhibitions carried it from city to city, and each stop made the story feel older and more settled. Newspapers repeated the claim because it sold papers and filled columns fast. A single display became many accounts. People who never saw the object still pictured it clearly because the description stayed simple, shocking, and easy to retell. Popular history books and cheap pulp collections then did the heavy lifting. They listed the Iron Maiden beside real punishments, so it sounded equally documented. Illustrations helped because an image looked like evidence even when the sources were thin. Translations spread the tale across borders, and the details hardened into a standard script. A spiked coffin, a screaming victim, a dark medieval mind. Repetition turned suggestion into certainty. In the 20th century, film and television finished the transformation. Sets and props made the device physical, and the camera made it feel factual. Writers used it as shorthand because it instantly signalled cruelty without explanation. The medieval period became a single mood: iron, spikes, and shadows. By then, the Iron Maiden no longer represented one questionable artifact. It represented the Middle Ages itself, everywhere for everyone. By the late 20th century, the Iron Maiden stopped looking like a solid medieval fact and started looking like a problem. Scholars and museum staff went back to basics. They checked dates, inventories, repair logs, and early descriptions. The trail did not lead into medieval courtrooms. It led into modern workshops and exhibition halls. The famous devices showed mismatched parts, newer metalwork, and stories that appeared after the objects did. Museums reassessed what they had displayed for generations. Labels changed. Some Iron Maidens disappeared from galleries or were presented as 19th century constructions rather than medieval tools. The point was not that people invented cruelty from nothing. The point was that this specific object did not fit the evidence. When curators asked where it came from, they found gaps filled by repetition, not records, and repetition had once sounded like proof. Meanwhile, the paperwork from real courts kept pointing elsewhere. Actual torture did not need a theatrical coffin. It relied on simpler methods that officials could control, explain, and repeat. Suspension, crushing, stretching, exhaustion, and threats that broke people without leaving a single iconic artifact behind. These practices showed up in routine documents, not rumour. The Iron Maiden shrank into a modern myth, and the everyday machinery of legal violence stood in its place. By the time museums pulled labels back and scholars dismantled the story, the Iron Maiden already lived a second life. It circulated online as a fact you could share in seconds. It turned up in listicles, memes, horror games, and casual history videos. The spikes stayed. The doubts faded. The legend offered a clean image of evil. One object, one villain, one moment of shock. That neat picture kept winning because it simplified what earlier societies actually ran on. Real punishment rarely needed a special machine. It depended on courts, paperwork, neighbours' testimony, and officials trained to break resistance with methods that left fewer questions. Pain became routine and administrative. It worked because it felt legal. The Iron Maiden distracted from that truth by making cruelty look rare, exotic, and separate from everyday order. In the present, the myth persisted because it solved a modern need, a single symbol for a complicated past. It let people point at the Middle Ages and feel safely distant. But the older reality never relied on a spiked coffin to control bodies and behaviour. It relied on public examples, private pressure, and the authority of institutions. The machine stayed famous. The system that made violence normal stayed easier to ignore.